Is your risk story killing your dreams? A big part of why so many people don't go for their dreams, live their passions, and reach their full potential is that the story they tell themselves is convincingly scary enough that it stops them in their tracks. And usually underpinning that is a meta story that risk is dangerous or bad. It's time to change that because, dear listener, you deserve your best life and not some watered down version of it. In this week's episode, we're looking at why taking risks is essential for success. And I'll be sharing my perspective on why risk is genuinely unavoidable, whatever your story. We'll be looking at what's the real issue when your story of risk stops you from living the life of your dreams, and how you can shift your risk story so that it works for you, including my secret for making risk fun. So let's dive in. Welcome to the Be a Brilliant Human podcast with me, Joel Young. If you're looking to improve your life, to heal, to grow, and mature as an individual, but maybe you found that some of the personal development and consciousness stuff has given you the impression that you need to be super serious and vigilant to get anywhere meaningful, or feeling like maybe you're just not up to snuff, well, this show is here to remind you of your humanity, and in fact that's where your true joy and brilliance lies. With over 25 years of experience in the transformation biz and having developed MPA, one of the world's simplest, pressure-free approaches to growth and well-being, if I do say so myself, I'll be sharing tips, steps, and insights that'll help you navigate all the aspects of life as a growth-seeking being. On this show, it comes to you with a good dose of humour, maybe a smattering of colourful language, a reminder not to take things so personally, and most importantly, to be kind to yourself along the way. Make sure you hit that follow button, and let's get into it. Hello, and welcome to the Be a Brilliant Human podcast with me, Joel Young. I'm delighted that you're here. We are at episode number 110. Which means two things. Firstly, it means there's 109 previous episodes for you to go binge listen to, especially if you're new here. And it means that you can find the show notes for today at www.beabrillianthuman.com/110. The show notes are great if you want to kind of get written down what some of the stuff is, the content. I usually do sort of crib notes for each of the shows. So, for example, today's show, I'll be asking you to ask yourself some questions. Those questions will be there on the show notes, a good reason to go there and find it. Also, a good reason to go there is if you want to leave me some feedback. There's a leave me a message button all over that website. You can click that button and leave me a voice message. I love feedback. I love to hear how these episodes touch you, how they affect you, what you've done as a result of them. And I'm even open to the occasional constructive feedback, let's put it that way. And you can also get in touch with me on social media. If you're on Facebook, you can go and find MPA Rocks. Just search MPA Rocks in the little search bar. You'll find the MPA page. MPA, if you're brand new, you're going, what does MPA got to do with Be a Brilliant Human? Well, MPA is what I'm most known for. It's called non-personal awareness, or the MPA process, a simple way to stop taking things personally, and so much more. You can also find it on all of my websites. There's the beabrillianthuman.com, there's the Joel Young MPA website, or the MPA Academy website. Basically, the MPA Academy is where my courses are. Joel Young MPA is all about MPA, and Be a Brilliant Human, what a surprise, it's the podcast website. But you can find information about MPA on all of them, and you can certainly download the sheet for free. If you go to any of those, you'll find it. All right, so today, Risk. Not the fantastic board game that I loved to play as a teenager, but generally, Risk, the risk of life. This has come up as an idea to talk to you about, not least of which because I am embarking on what could well be considered a big risk. This month really is happening early next month. And that is that my wonderful partner, Karen, is moving in with me here in Skipton in North Yorkshire on the 6th of January. So I've lived on my own, or I haven't lived with somebody else for 6 years. She hasn't lived with somebody else on a permanent basis for 12 years. So it's kind of a risk. You could look at it that way. And yet we are both fully up for the risk. We're both like, we're in for it. Now, it means a lot of shenanigans in terms of organizing things to move your stuff in, move my stuff around, all that kind of thing. And, we've certainly looked at the potential risks that are involved. Who knows what can happen at those kind of stages. But I did promise you I'd let you know how how I like to make risks fun, and we'll kind of get to that. But it made me think about risks and how often we delay these things, and we put things off, often for the whole of our lives, because we fear the risk. So today we're going to talk about that. And I'm going to start off by really looking at the idea that, we can avoid risks. Let's see. Let's dive in. So here's a bold statement for you. Life is risk. Without risk, there isn't life. Everything we do, every decision we make, every action we take is inherently has risk associated with it. So this idea that we can somehow avoid risk at a meta level, we're talking about meta level here, is really a misnomer. It's not true. It's really what we tend to do is we tend to sort of have our levels of risk storyboard, and then at a certain point we won't take the risk, right? But why is life full of risk? Think about it. Just think about everything you do in life. Like every time you walk out the door, sorry if I'm going to scare you now, there's a risk you're not coming back. You might be hit by a bus. You might slip on the ice, break your neck, But generally we walk out the door, right? Let's make it a little less dramatic than that, shall we? You walk out the door because you're going to a shop. The shop might be closed. It might be open. Now the time's on it, so it's going to be open, but there's a risk, right? There's always a risk. In fact, you go to the shop, every time you purchase something, you're taking a risk, especially online, say my fearful online friends. How do you know that what you buy is going to be something that is worth the money? It's going to do what you want it to do. Oh, of course, we offset the risk with certain research and those kind of things. That's all good stuff. But it's a risk. Every time you have a conversation, you are taking a risk of intimacy, a risk of sharing. There are so many risks involved with conversations. It's scary stuff. And yet, I bet you have conversations with people. In fact, every time you answer the phone, especially when it's a number you don't recognize, I'm about to take the risk. It's going to be one of those horrible marketing calls. Or is it maybe someone's calling me to give me some business? Oh, it's a risk. Oh, it might be bad news. It might be good news. It might be scary something or other. But every time you answer the phone, there's a risk. Every time you go on Facebook, we all know this, it's a risk. You may be about to be sucked into a vortex where 3 hours of your life, your useful life, are about to disappear to the void. And yet we take the risk all the time. I'm coughing at the thought of that one. Oh my God. When you go to sleep, my friend, that's a hell of a risk. Stay awake. Stay awake. You might not wake up. Every time you light the gas ring, boom. So I'm hamming it up here, but I'm making the point. Everything you do inherently has risk. So let's kind of agree to kind of put to the side, put on the shelf, or just completely throw out the idea that you can avoid risk. That's the kind of story that we tell ourselves, isn't it? We can avoid the risk. Now, probably you're thinking, well, we say we can mitigate the risk, and that's a pretty wise thing to do. Let's not be crazy and reckless. You need to look at being, the risk versus the reward, all those kind of things. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a while, but that's all fair enough. But what I'm talking about here is that one of the things that I've found that stops people is that kind of background thing about risk. The background idea that if something is labeled as risky, for whatever reason, we'll talk about those, but if it's labeled as generally risky, without much examination, it just gets put on the high risk pile, and then that prevents us from doing things. So, let's talk about what really happens here. Risk itself is inherent in life, so you can't avoid it, right? So what is the thing that makes the difference? It's ultimately the story that you tell yourself about the particular situation, you know, about being, about what the risk is. If you say, for example, if your meta story is I'm risk averse, then every time the idea of, when you really notice something as risky, chances are you're going to avoid it. But there are all sorts of risk stories that we tell ourselves. So I'm going to go through a few of those with you, and we'll look at, we'll just examine them. This is all about examining what works for you and what doesn't. So the biggest thing is that means that the idea of risk stops us from doing things is it's not the good stories. We'll get to those. It's the scary stories, right? It's what the fears are. The risk means that there's a potentially, usually there's a potentially good outcome, but there's a potentially bad outcome. And the bad outcome, the story of that, normally brings up fear. That's the whole idea. And again, by the way, I'm not completely saying that you should never have fear. Fear is a really good thing. But what we tend to do, especially in our kind of well-cultured, society, is we get very, very unreal about what real fears are. But it can stop us from really being who we are fully. It can stop us from doing the things that really matter to us. So it's kind of, if we deal with it at a meta level of because the fears will take all sorts of different shapes and sizes. We're going to look at, what is your, what are the fear stories that we generally come up with that mean that risk, the idea of risk, stops us from doing things that could be of great benefit to us. So one of the biggest things is the fear of failure. So that if I take a risk, I might fail. Now, here's where this starts to get pretty dodgy. It's like, first of all, if that's a bad story, you've got to have a secondary story around failure, right? Failure is a bad thing. Often what I find is when you start to examine these, the fear of failure, what's so bad about failing? Well, you've probably got a story about it. It probably means something about you. This is one of the keys. What does it mean about you if you fail? If what it means about you in your story is something, again, bad, that it's going to say something about you that is not good, then it ratchets up the evidence that this is too much of a risk and therefore not worth doing, right? It's amazing how much we fear failure. One of the things I'm going to be encouraging you to do is when you examine the stories is find a better one. Last week's episode 109, I talked about controlling the narrative, right? This is a classic example of where it's a good when you examine your narrative, this one being about failure, why failure is so scary. You put yourself in a disempowered place relative to it. And, so whenever there's a risk with possible failure, your failure story, failure is bad story, kicks in, and they all start to conspire to stop you from taking the risks that mean the potential benefits. So what if you could change your story about failure? Failure is part of life as much as risk is. We are always failing. You didn't learn to walk without failing. You didn't learn to ride a bike without failing. In fact, there's probably nothing that you've learned that's of any consequence that you didn't along the way fail. And the thing about this is you're probably going, yeah, I know that, Joel. But do you? Or maybe you do, but here's the thing. The point of this exploration, this examination of whether the risk averseness of doing things that really matter to you is failure, is like you've got to examine it in that context. Is this failure really so bad? I mean, most learning processes include failure, getting up, trying again. You might fail a number of times. In fact, every failure is something from which you can take a lesson and learn and improve. That's how we improve in every area of life. Failure, fantastic. Gotta love failure. It's brilliant. That's a different story, right? So what's the risk? The risk is failure. Cool. Failure's good. What I might even not fail. You never know. It does happen from time to time. But even if I fail, that's going to teach me something. I'll keep going. Now, that risk doesn't seem so bad, does it? All right. What's another common one? Rejection. The fear of rejection. It's a risk. We talked about conversations. I'm going to ask her out. Oh no, might get rejected. I just won't bother. And then I'll tell myself a story to back that up. You recognize this? Well, she's not really that into me, and, I'm not ready for a relationship, and how we stack on the self-justificating evidence for basically a fear of rejection, right? So again, rejection. What does that mean about you? It means I'm always being crap. I'm always terrible. Nobody likes me. I'm just not right. Not right. My body's not right. My hair's not right. My face isn't right. Nothing's right. That's what it means about me, rejection. Does it now? Well, that's going to scare the bejesus out of you, isn't it? There's a risk of rejection. Oh, no. Let's just not do any of that stuff. Or are we going to change the narrative? How can we change the narrative around rejection? Why could, rejection be a good thing? Well, so I ask her out. She says no. Well, clearly it wasn't right. That's good. That's information. Maybe I need to look at who I'm asking out. It's information. Information's good. Or simply that, it doesn't mean anything about me. Oh, hello, MPA. It's not personal. Maybe rejection is like a sign that I'm willing to take risks, which could be, on the back of today's episode, a story that, wow, I'm living life if I'm taking risks. It's not, or just even, it's not so bad. It's not so bad. Water off a duck's back. If you could be okay with rejection, man, your life would change. If you're somebody who is, generally avoids rejection, think about it. When you can start sort of telling stories about rejection, that it's okay, it's not a big deal. There's always another door that can open for you. All these kind of things. I mean, they sound like, cliches and, all that kind of stuff. But if you really go for them, they become cliches, if you like, because they're bloody good. These are great stories. There's always another door, and you've got to find it congruently, of course. Wow, you're going to be brave, right? You're going to be brave in relationships. You're going to be brave in business. You're going to be brave in asking to get your needs met. Amazing, because you just don't have a story that says it means something terrible about you that you get rejected. So there's a situation with a risk of rejection. No biggie. I can handle that. See what I'm doing here? Like each of the things we say, it's because it's a risk. We don't examine what's underneath it, and we don't empower ourselves to change it. What's another fear? Fear of loss. Well, that arguably is trickier. Maybe it's just trickier for me, Joel. No, loss. I can't find a positive story. Well, loss of money. It's just money. But the loss of money leads to a loss of my house. Loss of my financial standing, all these things. Am I going to pack up the stories that make it terrible, or what? Can I find some evidence? Well, when I lose something, I find something. Have I had experiences of loss before, say financial loss, where I've bounced back and been fine? I do in my life, certainly. Or maybe it's, a loss of a relationship. Again, that comes back to rejection. If I speak my honest truth in this relationship, I will lose her or lose him. Well, or, here's your alternative to that one. You become dishonest. You have to live with a mask for the rest of your life. You're hiding it. You secretly feel guilty. It puts a wedge between you and them, because intimacy isn't truly whole as long as you're being dishonest, which generally festers. And then what happens? Relationship breaks down. You start to resent because you can't be your true self. The relationship's over. Oh, look, there's the loss anyway. So, potential loss, if I tell my truth, it's quick. It's better. I'm now free to find somebody who's a fit. Better story, right? Loss is information. I'm using that one quite a lot. All of this, risk, sort of, in quotes, negative consequence from risk, really is information. Now, here's an interesting one. Last of my fears. The fear of success. Oh, it's a sneaky one. I can't take the risk of stepping out into the limelight. It might actually work. Then what? Oh my God. Then kick in the scary stories. If I'm a success, I'm more visible. If I'm more visible, I'm more vulnerable. If I'm more vulnerable, then I'll be criticized. If I'm criticized, then I'll crumple. If I crumple, I'll be in agony, and then it will all have been for nothing. I better not do that thing in case it works. If I risk that business idea, maybe it'll fail. Oh no. But even worse, maybe it'll succeed. Then I'll be too busy. I won't have time for my family. I'll earn loads of money. Then I'll be one of those 1%, and everyone will hate me, and I'll turn into an evil person. I'll be overwhelmed. I can't cope. So, on that example, both failure and success are terrible. Better stay in my job. But you see what we do, we create all these stories. So, the interesting thing here is, and the invitation here is to examine what the stories are. Because again, I'm going to come back to my basic tenet for you here, which is that, when you become comfortable with the risk, I'm not talking about being, I think I'm going to jump out of an aeroplane without a parachute because I want the feeling of freedom. And, I might die, but really the odds are you're going to die. You're going to die. This is real. Without a parachute, you're going to die. I mean, like, there's a 0.000000001% chance you might come out of that simply crippled. There we go. I'm not talking about those things. I'm talking about the stuff of life, right? Doing the things you love. Going out and starting a business that reflects your passion, your dreams. Taking a trip, doing a course, whatever it is, those things of life, that's where these ideas around risk block us. And one of the things we do, I'm going to add another layer of the story, one of the ways we hide taking responsibility for our crappy story around risk is we blame others. It's because of society. I can't do this because, society will, what will they do? Ostracize me, criticize me, heaven forbid see me. My loved ones. I blame my loved ones because, I can't do my passion because the risk is my loved ones won't like it. That's blaming. I'm being very hard with you today. It's blaming. Don't blame them. Take ownership of it. Talk to them. Take the risk of talking to them. Talk it through. Speak your truth about, what is it? Why is this important to you? Commit to figuring it out. That's kind of mitigating the risks. The real risk here is owning your shit, owning what you want, being true to you. That's the real risk. It's not that your loved ones it might not be the best for them. That's a story. Now, I'm not saying there aren't potentially consequences to our loved ones when we start living our passion. Absolutely there are. But where the risk stops us is those conversations, is being honest. One of the risks there is success. That my story that they're going to be, you can object to this idea, is going to be true. Well, check it out. Have a conversation. That's a risk. The risk of failure, the risk of rejection, the risk of loss, and the risk of success. What do they say? What if they say, oh my God, why haven't you told us this before? Go for it, Mum. Go for it, Dad. Go for it, husband, wife. Oh my God. Now you have to risk the failure, risk the exposure, risks moving forward. Again, the risks are ongoing. So be careful of within your story if you're blaming society, loved ones, others, work, bosses, all sorts of things we blame. I'm going to encourage you to come back and take responsibility for your story. And if there's something that really matters to you, I'm not, again, talking about stuff that's inconsequential. Have your risk story. It doesn't really matter to you anyway. It's the stuff that matters to you that is where this is really important to do the work. So let's talk a little bit about risk versus reward. I kind of touched into it. So if we were to rephrase this or look at this through a particular lens, put it that way, what I'm talking about here is, and I've kind of jokingly said, I'm not talking about taking the risk of jumping out the plane without a parachute. Just change your story and do it. I am not. Let's be absolutely clear. I'm not saying that. So we're talking about recklessness versus consciousness. What I'm plumbing for here for you is to become consciousness. There is a place to examine the validity of certain cautionary tales or scary stories. There's some truth in it. What I'm encouraging you here is to come into consciousness. So examining your stories around it is really about becoming conscious about where basically you're bullshitting yourself with a story which is preventing you from doing something that truly matters to you, versus being completely reckless and not considering in any intelligent way certain consequences. But as I laid out just now in that sort of example, where, you know, you tend to blame, say, your loved ones for it, what it really is like you're taking one big risk and using that as one big, you know, potential scary story, and that avoids a number of micro risks that would need to be taken to get you where you say you want to go. Risks of conversations, risks of potential conflict. That's another one I didn't really cover, risk of conflict. It's an aspect of rejection, I guess, or failure for some people. But it's that thing of really, the consciousness is like really examining, how does your story serve you? Does it serve you? You know, and what's really true. And this is where you can make risk-taking fun. Now, this requires a solid attitudinal shift. I like to think of examining risks as a matter of exploration and experimentation. Generally, I have historically been very scared of failure and rejection and loss and success, all of those, surprisingly. But since I really sort of looked at it and started to look at things in terms of experimentation, oh my God, I am so much freer to do things. This is especially true in my business. This podcast was kind of an experiment. In fact, most things that I do these days, I come into it with, let's have an experiment, see if this works, see if I like it, see if it works for my customers, see if it works for me. How I go about the processes of things is an experimentation. It's an exploration. The experimentation part really takes care of the whole idea of failure, and it puts me in a state of expectation of failure in a positive way. It's like there's going to be failures along the way, and I'm going to learn from them. This is experimentation and iteration. It's fantastic. And the exploration part is the exploration of if there are blocks in the way, you know, as I move forward through any particular process that's important to me. The exploration comes with the sort of the bent of, well, A, how can I make this fun? B, how can I make it work? You know, what are my stories? These are the explorations. What are my stories that I'm telling myself that are causing me stress? How can I change those stories so that it's more fun? Because fun's important to me. So that it works for me and for others. How can I explore with others how this works for them if I'm going off on a path somewhere? And basically the whole objective of all of that and where it becomes fun is like, it's like a puzzle. How can I find the win-win in this? This risky situation. How can I find a win-win? Now, I've already modeled that for you. Like when I've looked at the fear of failure and rejection, I converted it to a win-win. If I fail, that's great. You know, the risk of failure is a risk of success. I've neutralized the whole idea, the whole scary idea. Anyway, it's like it's a win if I'm successful. It's a win if I fail. There's no downside. The risk becomes kind of irrelevant. The question becomes the real question. This is the real question. What do you want to do? Who do you want to be? Where do you want to go? What do you want to do? What really matters to you? That's the real question, not what's the risk. The risk we can play with, you know. How real is the story that you tell yourself? That's the exploration. The exploration is how can I tell myself a better one? So again, I do recommend you listen to last week's episode 109, which goes more in depth into the whole narrative thing. All right, so I did say at the beginning of this episode, or somewhere early in the episode, can't remember when, that I'd be asking you to ask yourself some questions. I'm going to take what I've just shared with you, and I'm going to give you a bunch of good questions you can ask yourself, which will help you to go through this process of exploring where you find that risk stops you in your life. And of course, they will be in the show notes. If you want to go and have a look at them written down, you can find them at www.beabrillianthuman.com/110. So if you want to live the life of your dreams, whatever that looks like, it starts with a real question, which is, so what do you want to be doing? Or what do who do you want to be? Those questions I just asked you. What do you want to be doing or being? And then you need to ask yourself, what's the risk story you're telling yourself that is frightening you into not doing something that you'd really love to do? Bit of a word with that question, but basically, what's the risk story? What are you telling yourself? And you need to be in that state of exploration. And the signals here are going to be that you want to do something, but you're just not doing it. And often those stories are unconscious. So this question is going to help you dig out what is the scary story, And sort of sub-questions to that is, what bad stuff does it mean about you? What are the dire consequences to you or to your life or to others and those you care about that you're telling yourself? So rather like I did with the sort of the failure, the rejection, the loss, the success, you've got to look at it sort of what does it mean? What does it mean about you, about others, about life? What are the consequences that you're telling yourself? And you may wrap it up in all sorts of, very carefully worded stuff. But you've got to kind of get it out on paper. You've got to get it out in some way so you can actually have a genuine look at it and really, decide and really look at it with a kind of an intention to sift through it for bullshit. You've got to, I can't do this for you unless you come to a one-to-one session with me. I can certainly help you with calling bullshit on stuff. But really, it's an exercise where you've got to be willing to call bullshit on yourself, or at least examine it, because often it's so unconscious. We don't even dare look at it. In fact, doing this exercise is a risk. It's a paradox. And then the next step is to ask, how can you shift the narrative? How can you shift the story? And I've kind of demonstrated this with failure, rejection, loss. What are the consequences if the fear wins? Is a good question to ask to get leverage on yourself. If you let the fear win, what's going to happen? You end up living this life you're dissatisfied with. A dissatisfied life. Wow, that's pretty crap, isn't it? That gets leverage on yourself if the fear wins. And that'll put you in a better position to ask, what great stuff could it mean about you? So you had all these terrible meanings about what rejection meant about you, what failure meant about you. What great stuff could it mean about you? Again, like I said with rejection. Hey, I'm willing to take the risk. That's actually a positive thing. Failure. If I'm willing to fail, I'm willing to succeed. If I'm willing to live, I'm willing to get out there. I'm willing to make progress. What great stuff could it mean about you? And what are the potential benefits to you? What are the benefits of doing it? Of actually taking the risk? If it does pan out, even if you have to go through a whole series of failure and rejection and loss, and even if you've got a scary story about success, what are the positives there? What are the benefits to you? What's the benefits to your life? Live a life of dissatisfied emptiness, or live a life of, even if you've risked and failed, you've lived a life of passion and love. What are the benefits to others? Your loved ones might kick up a stink in the short term, but ultimately, are they freer? They have you more fully. If you're their spouse, and you want to go off and do this thing, it changes the dynamic, but they have you. You feel like you go from a place of being kind of all flattened out and passionless in the relationship to suddenly you've filled yourself up and you bring that passion back to the relationship. They're a bit kind of, it's a bit changey, I'm not sure, it makes me nervous and insecure, to begin with. And then they go, oh my God, it's the best thing you ever did. We've got the relationship that we always wanted and always knew could be. That's a better story. I like better stories. So ask those questions of yourself. Bottom line is, I'm asking you to really take a good hard look, call bullshit on yourself, if you find that this amorphous idea of risk or certain dodgy stories are stopping you from living your best life. Putting aside the whole past life thing, and let's face it, past lives, you were somebody else. This is the only time you get to be you. This is the one time you get to be you in this context. Yeah, maybe you'll come back and do it again, But to all intents and purposes, this personality, this specific iteration of your soul only happens once. Make the best of it. Question your stories. Decide what matters to you and go live it. See you next time. Thanks so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this show, I'd love you to do me a solid and tell someone about it. They can find us on Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, and most other podcast platforms. Plus, if you visit the website www.BABrillianthuman.com, you can share the show notes to social media and make my day. Also, make sure you hit that follow button, and if you haven't yet downloaded the MPA process sheet, head on over to joelyoungmpa.com and get your free copy today. Big love, and see you next time.